Thank you for coming back and listening with me today. I hope you're doing well, and I wish you a beautiful day filled with calm, clarity, and a little hope. If these stories mean something to you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Every bit of support helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get into this story together. Helix Transit Medical Ring turned in the dark above Orthian with the steady patience of a machine built to survive other people's emergencies. From the observation corridor, its white medical arms looked clean against the freight lanes below. Inside, nothing felt clean that morning. Nothing felt calm. Dr. Vivian Rourke stood in Neurological Intake 3 over a transparent display that refused to simplify the patient in front of her. Every time she narrowed the scan, new damage appeared. Axonal tearing. Severe pressure along the upper relay cluster. Thermal interference from a failed stabilizer in the transport capsule. The anatomy was alien, but the collapse pattern was familiar in the worst possible way. A mind was slipping away faster than the numbers on the wall wanted to admit. Vivian was 39, a senior neurosurgeon from Earth, and the ranking neurotrauma lead on this shift. She worked on Helix because it sat where medicine and politics rubbed each other raw. It was a neutral station with a civilian mandate and a shared emergency charter. If a convoy captain, trade minister, union organizer, or council observer dropped half dead between systems, Helix was often where the body arrived first. Vivian had learned to read power before it announced itself. The people around this bed did not need introductions to tell her they were dangerous. One wore the gray lattice insignia of the Council Biomedical Licensing Office. Another carried the formal escort seal of Caith Concord, one of the few blocks in the Galaxy Council large enough to shift an agenda just by leaving the room. Three more stood behind them in silence, armed with the cold confidence of officials who expected a hospital to obey their tone before it obeyed the medical facts. The patient lay under a restraint field, broad-shouldered even now, his skin faded from polished bronze to ash. His chest moved in shallow mechanical rhythm with the capsule ventilator. His cranial crest had been cut open by impact fragments. Blood had already been replaced twice in transit. He had arrived conscious for less than 3 minutes, just long enough to fail a motor check and lose speech. Dr. Rourke, said the licensing officer, you will confine intervention to Protocol 6-8 Hz for cross-species neural collapse, pending central confirmation. Vivian did not look up. If I confine intervention to Protocol 6-8, he dies. That protocol has council clearance. That protocol was written for a stable relay environment and a patient who still has time. The council standard was not offered for debate. Now Vivian looked at him. He was lean and dark-scaled, with the polished restraint of someone trained to sound impersonal while making moral choices in passive voice. His badge identified him as Senior Inspector Myrex Tal. I'm not debating the standard, Vivian said. I'm telling you what it does to the person on this table. Tell it not move. You are authorized to preserve until central oversight confirms expanded measures. Preserve what? Vivian asked. A body with no surviving neural continuity? Another figure stepped forward, taller, gold-skinned under the lights. The family crest at the throat clasp was small but unmistakable. Caith Concord. I am Advocate Saran Vale, the newcomer said. The patient is Sorrel Caith. You will not employ unlicensed human methods. There it was, the missing weight. Sorrel Caith, not a minister. Worse, an heir, the public face of the block's reform wing. Rumors had tied him to a pending civilian corridor accord that could redirect emergency medical traffic across border systems. If he died here, the story would not stay in this room. Helix would be dragged into the kind of inquiry stations did not recover from. Vivian turned back to the scan. She had seconds to decide whether that political truth mattered more than the medical one. One branch of the damaged neural lattice still pulsed, thin and erratic. The relay spine had not fully collapsed. There was a path. Narrow, ugly, restricted, but real. Her deputy, Dr. Leanne Mercer, moved to her side. Human, 46, trauma specialist. Calm in a way only exhausted competence could be calm. The ventrix are dropping, Lien said quietly. If we go standard, we buy maybe 7 minutes. And if we go adaptive graft? Vivian asked. Lien hesitated. If the coupling holds, maybe we keep cortical identity. If it fails, they say you carve him up with a band toy. It isn't a toy. I know. Vivian watched the pulse line dip, recover, then dip again. Years earlier, in Earth orbital trauma, she had stood over a dock worker from Luna whose wife had not reached the unit before he lost coherence under a license delay. The procedure that might have saved him had existed then too, trapped behind transfer restrictions and a liability wall. Vivian had followed protocol because the room, the hospital, and the law demanded it. The man had died in a way paperwork later described as inevitable. She had never trusted that word again when it came from people who did not have to watch the eyes go empty. She placed both hands on the edge of the table and spoke without raising her voice. Inspector Tal, Advocate Vale, I am making the record clear. The current protocol is medically insufficient for this presentation. There is a viable intervention available. It is prohibited by cross-species licensing restrictions, not by proof that it cannot work. If I wait for central confirmation, your patient dies before permission arrives. Vale's expression hardened. You are asking us to expose the heir of Caith Concord to an unauthorized human procedure. I'm telling you he is already exposed to death. Tal activated his recorder. The Council does not grant bedside exception authority to civilian surgeons in mixed jurisdiction cases. Then your Council can explain his death in 12 polished languages, Vivian said. I will not do it for them. Lien met her eyes once. That was enough. Helix rules allowed the senior attending to take direct responsibility in imminent loss cases if they accepted legal exposure. It was the clause neutral. Hospitals lived on and larger powers hated. Vivian keyed her authorization. A red line crossed the display. Personal liability accepted. Tal stepped forward. Dr. Rourke, you are now operating outside Council clearance. No, Vivian said. I'm operating ahead of it. The room changed all at once. Nurses moved. Fields brightened. Surgical drones descended and rotated into sterile alignment. Lien rerouted the relay mapping. An anesthetist from a station's Varen staff adjusted gas exchange for alien blood chemistry while speaking every value aloud for the record. Vivian opened the adaptive graph library and ignored the warning wall that bloomed across the screen. Unauthorized cross-species neural interface. Patent-restricted architecture. Civil liability. Criminal review possible under Council biomedical law. Possible. Fine. Lock cranial support, Vivian said. Bring me the Helix civilian waiver channel. If they're going to prosecute me, they can at least spell my name correctly. The first cut was not dramatic. It was precise, shallow, and careful around the shattered crest channels. The drama lived in the clock. Every minute the pressure climbed. Every delay killed viable tissue. Vivian worked through a rain of numbers and objections, through the stiff breathing of officials behind the field line, through the old anger in her own chest that rose whenever a machine tried to tell her a life had reached the legally acceptable edge of rescue. The prohibited technique was not magic. It was an adaptive bridge, a flexible human-designed neural scaffold first built for radiation trauma in deep space miners, then improved for species with distributed relay systems. It required live mapping, constant adjustment, and clinical judgment in real time. That was part of why the licensing blocks hated it. It refused easy ownership. It made monopoly harder. Vivian threaded the first bridge node into place. Sorrel convulsed. The line dropped. Rose. Flattened. Rose again. Coupling resistance up 6%, Lien said. I see it. Core relay drift. Compensating. Tal was saying something on the far side of the room, but Vivian no longer heard words, only cadence. Objection. Threat. Record. Fine. Let him document the shape of his own helplessness. Vivian moved deeper. She found the torn pathways around the pressure bloom and rerouted impulse load through the adaptive lattice. It was not elegant surgery. Elegant surgery lived in journals. This was survival work. Pressure, reroute, preserve continuity, and pray the system you were touching still wanted to be itself when you gave a road back. 2 hours later, the crisis ended not with triumph, but with a number holding where it had no right to hold. Sorrel Kaith did not wake. He did not speak. He did not reward the room with a dramatic return, but he remained neurologically present in a way Protocol 6-8 would never have allowed. Vivian stepped back first. She felt every year of her training in her spine. Lien exhaled hard enough to laugh once, though nothing about the room was funny. Stable for transfer to containment recovery, Lien said. Tal's recorder light was still on. You have just committed an unlicensed intervention on a council heir. I have just prevented a death in a civilian hospital, Vivian answered. Advocate Vale stared at the patient. For the first time, fear cracked the polished calm of his face. Not fear that Sorrel might die. Fear that he might live and make the last 2 hours impossible to classify. The response came fast. The operating suite doors sealed under remote order. External access froze. Helix security, neutral and embarrassed, took positions outside their own medical bay under temporary council authority. Every recording of the procedure was copied, sealed, and marked for review. Staff were separated for questioning. Even the instrument tray was tagged. Lien peeled off one glove and looked at Vivian with tired disbelief. You know what the public feed is going to do with this? Vivian stripped off her own gloves more slowly. That depends which lie gets there first. It turned out both did. Before she reached the post-operation corridor, the first leak hit the station channels. Not doctor save life. Not emergency surgery prevented death. The line rolling through the orbitals read, Earth surgeon used prohibited neural access on council. Heir. The wording did exactly what it was designed to do. It made the patient sound like state property, the surgery sound like violation, and humanity sound reckless by species. Vivian stopped beneath a wall screen as the headline spread through 6 translations. Helix staff looked away when they passed her. Not from shame, from calculation. Everyone on a neutral ring knew what happened when your work became a test case for larger powers. People began speaking carefully because their pay, licenses, and futures lived in the spaces between nouns. Lien came to stand beside her. He's still alive. Yes, that matters. Vivian watched the line of text crawl again. It mattered. It also would not be enough. Below the glass, Orthian's trade lanes kept moving. Freight barges, embassy cutters, medical shuttles, salvage tugs. The galaxy rarely paused for the moral clarity of one operating room. It turned crisis into traffic and traffic into policy. Somewhere in that machine, people were already deciding whether she was a surgeon who had saved an heir or a human who had touched something forbidden. Vivian looked toward recovery isolation 2, where Sorrel Kaith now lay under station guard, and said the only thing that felt fully true. If he wakes, they have a problem. And if he doesn't, Lien asked. Vivian met her eyes. Then I do. Helix had a sound at artificial dawn that no one noticed unless they had worked too many nights. It was the shift in pressure when the ring rebalanced its life support after the freight lanes thinned. A long sigh inside the walls. Vivian heard it as she sat alone in review chamber C 12 hours later, reading her own surgical report through the thin headache that came from too much stimulant coffee and too little sleep. The report was clear because she had made it clear. Time of arrival. Initial scan results. Observed deterioration. Failure of standard protocol under present conditions. Rationale for adaptive intervention. Sequence of steps. Immediate outcome. She had written it for 3 audiences at once. Honest physicians. Hostile lawyers. And herself 6 months later, when memory might start sanding the rough edges off necessity. The door opened without warning. Inspector Myrex Tal entered with 2 station legal aides and a portable seal unit. He took the chair opposite her as though both of them had accepted this arrangement weeks ago. Dr. Rourke, he said, pending council review, you are restricted from further unsupervised cross-species neural cases. I wasn't aware you could run Helix staffing. Temporary emergency authority applies when a council-protected patient is involved. Convenient. Tal ignored that. Your team has been interviewed. The instrument data has been secured. The procedure file has been isolated. By isolated, you mean hidden. By isolated, I mean protected from uncontrolled dissemination. Vivian leaned back. You say protected when you mean owned. His eyes flicked to the legal aids, then back to her. You continue to confuse medicine with political theater. No, Vivian said. I understand exactly when theater begins. It begins when the life on the table stops being the center of the room. Tal set a file slate between them. This is a preliminary notice of possible violation under Council biomedical statutes. Unauthorized application of restricted neural bridge architecture. Cross-jurisdiction clinical deviation. Exposure of a protected patient to unlicensed species-originated intervention. He was already exposed to death under your licensed intervention. Tal clasped his hands. You make that claim as though urgency excuses structure. I make it because I watched your structure run out the clock. For the first time, irritation touched his voice. Protocol exists because improvised success in one room can produce harm in many others. Vivian pushed the slate back without signing. Then show me those others. Don't show me the one you nearly lost because paperwork needed to feel important. Tal Stuth. You're not being asked to agree. That has been obvious from the start. When he was gone, one of the Helix legal aides lingered. She was an older woman named Petra Selm, and her gift was explaining institutional disasters in sentences short enough for frightened staff to survive. Off record? Petra asked. There is no off record, Vivian said. Petra almost smiled. Then call this unpaid wisdom. They want this contained as an exception. They do not want discovery. If you fight it narrowly, you might keep your license and lose the rest. If you fight it broadly, you may keep the rest and lose your quiet life forever. Vivian rubbed at the base of her thumb, a habit from residency she had never broken. I don't have a quiet life. You still have more of one than you think. After Petra left, Vivian walked to Recovery Isolation 2. The corridor outside was lined with both Helix staff and Council security. Neutral station nurses stood beside armored escorts whose insignia made every passerby remember the patient inside was important enough to bend gravity around him. Through the observation field, Vivian could see Sorrel Kaith beneath a low light, his cranial bandages clean, his vitals steadier than they had been at intake. But the monitors told a harder truth. The adaptive bridge was holding. The surrounding system was angry. Tiny spikes shivered through the relay map at uneven intervals. Lien waited by the door with a cup of synth tea that had gone cold. How bad? Vivian asked. Not catastrophic, Lien said. Not pretty either. He's showing rebound storms along the upper relay chain. From the delay before surgery. From that, and from the fact that his nervous system spent hours preparing to die under a protocol that wasn't made to save him. Vivian studied the spikes. Can we damp them? We could try. If we go too aggressive, we flatten responsiveness and hand Tal a speech about human overcorrection. He's going to make speeches regardless. Lien lowered her voice. There's more. Senard Patent Compact put out a statement. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Of course they had. Lien pulled up the release. It was polished, sorrowful, and venomous in the way only institutional language could be. It warned against species-specific improvisation in a shared medical ecosystem. It praised regulatory caution. It expressed concern that emotional reaction to a high-visibility case might endanger millions by weakening trusted biomedical standards. No mention that their standards were failing in real time. Vivian said, no mention that the procedure existed before today's panic. No mention that human trauma units have used adaptive bridge variants for years in legal gray zones. Gray zones are where people hide the profitable parts. Lien watched her over the rim of the cold cup. You already knew that. Vivian did not answer. She stepped into the room instead. Sorrel Kaith looked less like a symbol up close. He looked like an exhausted adult man trying to climb back into a body that had betrayed him in public. His crest channels, even bandaged, carried the formal symmetry of Kaith lineage markers. His hands were large, long-fingered, and scarred in places that suggested he handled real equipment, sometimes despite whatever speeches or negotiations filled his calendar. So much political mythology was built around people who did not resemble themselves when unconscious. Vivian checked the interface manually. She preferred touching the truth when possible. Screens simplified. Skin did not. You are making everyone's life difficult, Lien said from the doorway. He started it by crashing in my bay. Fair. Vivian adjusted the field strength. Sorrel's pulse shifted by 1 degree, then settled. What do we know about the incident that brought him here? She asked. Transport capsule failure during a corridor transfer, Lien said. Officially mechanical. Unofficially, Keith Concord and 2 rival blocks were in close talks over civilian medical access routes at the border. If he dies now, every faction gets to blame a different enemy. So no one wants a simple answer. No one powerful ever does. Vivian finished the adjustment and stared at the bridge map. Something bothered her. Not the damage itself. The pattern around it. A familiar asymmetry near the upper relay split. She had seen something close to that before, years ago in a buried consult archive from an Alum patient who died before transfer approval came through. She brought up the internal comparison library and ran a quick shape match. The system protested restricted access, then returned 3 partial parallels and 1 full redacted block. Full redacted blocks on Helix were rare. Full redacted blocks tied to civilian deaths were rarer. Interesting, Vivian murmured. Lien came nearer. What is it? I've seen this geometry before. In humans? In everyone, Vivian said, and felt the shape of a larger trouble begin to press against the room. That changed the case. It was no longer only about whether Sorrel would live. It was about whether his case had happened before in quieter rooms and cleaner language. Helix had no real night, only lighting cycles and the illusion of quieter hours. Vivian stayed through 2 of them. She reviewed old neural trauma summaries until her eyes ached and the station clock changed date. The pattern held longer than coincidence should have allowed. These were not identical injuries. They were not even the same species or the same listed cause. But they broke at the same point. The same relay failure threshold. The same regulatory delay. The same comm language after death. Incompatible outcome. Species-specific instability. Exceptional physiology. Unsuitable for adaptive intervention. The wording changed. The ending did not. By midday, she had 13 cases across 5 systems. All adults. All critically placed inside trade, transit, or diplomatic networks where the death of one person carried wider consequence. All filtered through regulatory review before deterioration past the point of rescue. All dead under legal language written far from the bed. Vivian sent the file to a secure Helix partition and brought Petra Seln and Lien into the review room. Petra listened without interrupting, which was how Vivian knew the problem had moved from clinical concern to institutional danger. You are telling me, Petra said at last, that if your pattern is real, the issue is not just one banned procedure. The issue is that a whole category of patients may have been left to die under a licensing architecture designed to stop anyone from seeing the pattern clearly. Yes, Vivian said. Lien added, and one of the first public survivors is lying 2 corridors away under station guard. Petra blew out a slow breath. Then you cannot just fight your own case anymore. Vivian looked at the file. I know. What you have is still circumstantial. What I have is enough to ask why these records were fractured across systems. Petra nodded reluctantly, which is exactly why anyone benefiting from that fracture will move before you do. As if summoned by the sentence, the wall screen flashed with an incoming station bulletin. Sorrel Keith's condition had shifted. Vivian and Lien were already moving before the text fully resolved. The storm hit harder this time. Sorrel's upper relay chain fired in chaotic bursts. The adaptive bridge overcompensating against tissue that still wanted the clean path it no longer had. His body arched once against the restraint field. Monitors spat numbers too fast for non-medical panic to keep up. Council escorts crowded the door. One of them shouted for procedure suspension, as though stopping the doctor mid-rescue would somehow restore legal elegance to the room. Vivian cut through the noise with the tone she reserved for rooms, trying to choose fear over order. Everyone not assigned to this patient out. To her mild surprise, they obeyed. Lien sealed the door. A veteran nurse named Ossett stabilized the ventilator drift. Vivian dialed the damping sequence by hand instead of trusting the auto protocol, because the auto protocol had been written for cases that had never been allowed to become cases. She watched the bridge map and threaded support through the same path she had opened in surgery, less invasive now, more persuasive and forceful. "Talk to me," Lien said. Upper chain resentment spike. "The delayed damage is propagating. Can we hold him? We can if his system stops, try to obey the original failure path. And if it doesn't." Vivian did not answer. She did not have one worth saying aloud. Minutes stretched. The storm narrowed. Then, with the grudgingness of a body that had reason to distrust everyone in the room, Sorrel's relay pattern settled into something survivable. Osset leaned back first. "He is stabilizing." Lien let out a breath sharp with relief. "Tao will say the storm proves your method is unstable." Vivian wiped her hands. "Tao can say what he likes. It proves the damage was worse than his people admitted when they were busy policing my options." When the door unsealed, Advocate Saran Vale was waiting again, elegant and tired and furious in a controlled way that made him look older than before. "You were warned," he said. Vivian faced him squarely. "And I warned you. The delay before surgery did this. You continue to treat your interpretation as fact. I continue to keep your heir alive while you audition for denial." His nostrils flared. "You should be very careful, Dr. Rourke. Keith Concord is not your enemy." "No," Vivian said. "At the moment, my enemy is anyone who mistakes procedure for morality." For a second, she thought he might answer honestly. Instead, he said, "The Council Medical Conduct Chamber has accepted provisional jurisdiction. You will be summoned." There it was. Not the start of the story. The price of the first choice. Vale's gaze slid past her to the room where Sorrel lay. If he recovers enough to testify, matters may complicate further. Vivian heard the meaning beneath the words. Not if he recovers enough to live. If he recovers enough to speak. After he left, Petra sent 2 words to Vivian's pad. They move. Earth's diplomatic offices on Helix occupied a ring segment that pretended to be smaller than it was. The furniture was restrained, the lights warm, the art deliberately modest. But the walls were built with the kind of layered privacy only important governments could afford. Vivian was taken there the next day at the request of the Earth civilian mission. That request would have felt flattering in any other life. Ambassador Nia Surat met her in a conference room overlooking Orthian's cloud bands. Surat was in her 50s, from Nairobi by way of 3 treaty stations, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood institutions well enough to dislike them without romanticizing outsiders. She did not waste time with sympathy before getting to the problem. "The Council intends to narrow this to your individual conduct," Surat said. "Synarch intends to widen it just enough to frighten every mixed-species hospital into compliance. Keith Concord is divided. Some of them owe Sorrel their future and would like him alive. Others would prefer a tidy scandal to a structural inquiry. You called me here to tell me I am inconvenient. I called you here because Earth has to decide whether inconvenient is useful." The ambassador slid a sealed packet across the table. A back-channel proposal. Vivian did not touch it. Already, power moves quickly when it smells precedent. Surat watched her. If Earth refrains from demanding a systemic investigation, the Council review will likely stop at a censure. Your access restrictions may be lifted in stages. Helix would receive elevated recognition as a controlled research partner under revised licensing. Earth gains standing inside the medical architecture instead of outside it. Vivian almost laughed. Not because it was absurd, because it was so rational. The offer had been built by adults who understood exactly how systems grow roots. Not through obvious evil, through advancement, terms, and the careful isolation of one victim as a regrettable but manageable exception. And the people in those files? Vivian asked. Surat's expression did not change. Not covered. So we get a better seat at the table if we agree not to ask how many bodies built the table. Surat did not deny it. You should know the proposal exists before others start describing it as mercy. Vivian finally sat. Fatigue made the room feel subtly farther away than it should have. What does Earth want? She asked. Surat gave the only honest answer available. Earth wants three incompatible things: to protect you, to avoid surrendering moral ground, and to stop this case from becoming an excuse to paint humanity as impulsive and unsafe in a fragile political moment. Vivian looked through the glass at Orthium below. Trade storms moved over the atmosphere like bruises dissolving in water. I can live with being painted unsafe. Surat studied her for a moment. Can you live with being made singular? They will try to turn you into the anomaly, so the system does not have to become the subject. They're already trying. Then we need more than anger. Surat leaned forward. We need evidence. Witnesses. A way to prove this is not one room under pressure, but a buried pattern. Vivian slid the compiled file across the table. I started. Surat read the first page, then the next. Her stillness sharpened. Where did you get these? Helix archives, cross-station fragments, civilian consult repositories. Enough to form a question, and enough to make enemies. I noticed. Surat touched the redacted block tied to the full parallel case. This one, total seal. We need to know what sits behind it. Petra, joining by secure link from Legal Review, said, I may know who can tell us. A former protocol architect named Halendrax. He resigned 7 years ago after a closed dispute over adaptive bridge classifications. Surat looked up. Can we find him before they do? Petra did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. They found Halendrax on the station's outer residential band, where long-term contractors and former specialists rented views of the freight lanes to remind themselves that movement still existed. He was older than Vivian expected, though age showed differently across species. His face had deepened around the eyes. His hands shook slightly when he poured tea. The apartment was full of obsolete interface hardware and paper books, a sign not of nostalgia, but of distrust. I assumed, he said after hearing why they had come, that if anyone ever reopened this question, it would happen after I was dead. Vivian sat opposite him, while Lien checked the room sweep a second time, and Petra remained on a silent legal link. Then help me while you're alive. Drax gave a humorless smile. Human directness. I remember why they feared employing it. They employed it just fine when it built profitable things. Yes. He set the cup down. That was the mistake. He confirmed more than Vivian had hoped and less than she had needed. The adaptive bridge family had once been studied as a shared civilian emergency tool for species with unstable relay anatomies. Early data showed promise. Then came the patent races, ownership fights, insurance models, block bargaining. If the bridge became widely teachable, certain licensed interventions would lose value overnight. If the bridge remained restricted, high-complexity neural emergencies would continue to flow through approved centers and approved chains. So they buried it, Vivian said. Not completely. That would have been too obvious. They narrowed it, classified parts as species contingent, demanded impossible validation thresholds for shared use, broke the literature into non-overlapping fragments, reworded fatalities so the pattern stayed hidden. Lien leaned in. Did they know people would die? Drax looked at her with terrible patience. Every system knows someone will die when access narrows. The question is whether those deaths can be distributed quietly enough to preserve the appearance of necessity. Vivian felt the old dockworker from Luna standing somewhere just beyond memory, not as a face now, but as a weight. You designed part of the restrictions? She asked. I designed one of the early safety branches, Drax said. Then I watched it become a gate. I resigned before the final consolidation. Why no public objection? He stared out at the freight lights. Because I was weak the first time? Because they offered me a chair if I stopped asking what the civilian numbers meant? Because by the time I refused, the architecture was already profitable enough to defend itself? Which answer would you respect more? Vivian did not answer. Respect was not the point. What I need, she said, is not confession. I need testimony. Drax laughed once, bitter and soft. Then you need me faster than I can safely exist. He agreed to prepare a technical statement. It was not ideal. It was not enough. But it was one line of attack the case did not yet have. Vivian left his apartment with the sensation of carrying a lit wire through dry weather. That sensation worsened when Sorrel Keith briefly regained consciousness that evening. It happened during an otherwise ordinary neurocheck. Vivian was at his bedside with Osset and one Keith physician when Sorrel's eyes opened and fixed, not wandering at random, but locating her with deliberate effort. His voice, when it came, was rough and breath-limited. "You are the human surgeon." "Yes," Vivian said. "I'm Dr. Vivian Rourke. You're in recovery on Helix. Do you know your name?" His mouth tightened against the effort. "Sorrel Keith. Good. Do you know what happened?" He tried to lift one hand. Failed. His gaze moved to the side, to the Keith physician, then back to Vivian in a way that felt less like fear than evaluation. "Escort delayed," he said. "You argued?" "Yes." His pupils tightened. "Did they record my consent?" The question changed the room. Vivian kept her tone steady. "You were not able to give formal operative consent before you lost speech." Sorrel closed his eyes for one long second, then opened them again. "They knew protocol would fail," he whispered. "They said central approval mattered more than improvisation." The Keith physician stiffened. Osset looked at Vivian. No one moved. "Who said that?" Vivian asked. Sorrel swallowed against pain. The wording came from the licensing exchange. Advocate Vale was present. Inspector Tal was present. Whether they originated it or accepted it, I cannot say. I could say no one in that room prioritized my survival over procedural control until Dr. Rourke did. Before Vivian could ask more, his relay pattern spiked, and the moment was gone. Sedation followed. Stillness returned. But the room had changed permanently. Later, in the corridor, Osset said what everyone was thinking. If he can repeat that underprotected testimony, the case becomes something else. Vivian looked through the field at Sorrel's sleeping face. "Which is why they will do everything possible to make sure it does not happen on my terms." The warning proved correct within hours. Drax disappeared the next morning. No broken door. No public struggle. Just an empty apartment, a disconnected legal link, and building security insisting he had checked out under personal authority before dawn. Petra read the report and used a word she rarely used. "Abduction," she said flatly, or coerced removal dressed as discretion. Surratt did not waste time on outrage. We proceed as though he will not be available. Vivian stood in the Earth Mission conference room with Drax's abandoned partial testimony on the display and felt the case trying to narrow again around her neck. A missing witness, a recovering patient under pressure, a hostile licensing office, attempting compromise. This was how large systems won, not by disproving reality, by exhausting it until only manageable fragments remained. Surratt looked at her. "The summons is official. 3 days. Galaxy Council Medical Conduct Chamber. Hellenic Orbit Transfer?" Vivian asked. "Yes. Hellenic is a public venue. They want legitimacy, but controlled legitimacy." Vivian nodded slowly. "Good. Let them want both." The ambassador studied her. "I need to know now, Vivian, if this becomes larger than your own defense, are you prepared to lose the offer that would protect you?" Vivian thought of the dock worker from Luna, of the 13 files, of Drax resigning too late, of Sorrel asking whether anyone had recorded his consent, as if he already knew the answer would matter less than the line someone wished to preserve around his body. "I was never being protected," she said. "I was being priced." The chamber sat inside a council complex built to look impartial from a distance. Clean arcs, soft stone colors, transparent walkways over gardens no one used. It was designed to calm visitors before procedure removed their leverage. Vivian arrived under summons, not invitation. The difference was visible in where her escort stopped and where theirs did not. Earth had chosen its line overnight. They would not trade the case for position. They would not arrive as romantics either. Surratt and Petra came with her. Lien remained on Helix to oversee Sorrel's recovery and maintain the live medical channel. Public traffic around the chamber had swollen beyond expectation. Civilian health unions, survivor advocates, charter physicians, trade reporters, not a mob, something more dangerous to power. a crowd organized enough to stay legible. On the main concourse screen, Synarch spokespeople gave measured interviews about the importance of trusted regulation. A counterfeed rolled the names of confirmed civilian families requesting review of sealed neural deaths. Vivian did not recognize the names. She carried them anyway. Inside, the chamber was less grand than television made it look. That was its own kind of design. Practical architecture could make harsh decisions feel administrative instead of historical. The dais held 3 adjudicators from different blocks. Tal sat with the presenting office. Saran Vale occupied a Keith advisory bench 2 tiers back, his face unreadable. The public galleries curve high overhead behind transparency fields. Surat leaned toward Vivian once as they took their places. They will try to make the scale itself discipline you. I've worked trauma bays with worse acoustics, Vivian said. Surat's mouth moved at one corner. Good. The opening was exactly as Petra had predicted. Not accusation alone. Framing. The presenting counsel praised Vivian's dedication, acknowledged the stress of emergency conditions, and then carefully shifted everything toward the sanctity of shared standards. Civilization, he implied, survived because individuals could not substitute personal conviction for regulated systems. A doctor, especially one from species with limited integrated licensing access, could not be allowed to decide that her urgency outranked collective safety. Vivian listened, noting every hidden premise. Human origin as quiet doubt. Shared safety as a phrase large enough to hide anything. Singular event as insulation against pattern. When her turn came, she did not begin with outrage. She began the way she would have taught a resident. My name is Dr. Vivian Rourke. I am a neurosurgeon from Earth and the senior neural trauma attending who received Sorrel Keith at Helix Transit Medical Ring. I am here because a patient arrived in catastrophic relay collapse. A license protocol was insufficient to preserve continuity, and I chose the only intervention with a real chance to keep him alive. That alone shifted the room slightly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was simple. She walked them through intake, through timing, through the standard's intended use, and why this presentation fell outside its practical reach. Through the difference between legal authorization and physiologic reality. The adjudicators interrupted with technical clarifications. She answered them. Tal objected twice to scope. Both times the chair allowed her to continue. Then the presenting counsel changed tactics. He called up the post-operation storm and asked whether the instability proved the procedure had imposed uncontrolled risk. No, Vivian said. It proves the underlying damage kept evolving after a delayed intervention window. The question is not whether risk existed. The question is whether the licensed alternative reduced it. It did not. It ensured death. Tal rose. The witness repeatedly equates her judgment with truth while disregarding the structure created to protect against exactly such personal certainty. Vivian looked directly at him. I'm disregarding nothing. I am distinguishing between a structure that imagines rescue and one that performs it. There was a sound in the gallery then. Not applause, because chamber rules would have stopped that. Just the collective intake of people who had heard a sentence land. The adjudicators pressed harder. Why was the bridge restricted? Did Earth have uncontrolled variants? Could broader adoption create catastrophic misuse? Vivian answered where she could and refused false simplifications where she could not. She would not claim the procedure was universal. She would not claim all restrictions were malicious. She would claim, and did, that a restricted tool had been treated as untouchable long after the evidence justified broader emergency pathways. Then the chamber turned to Keith Concord. Saran Vale spoke with the precision of a man trying to keep a house standing while rooms burned behind him. He emphasized Sorrel's importance. He acknowledged the emotional difficulty of the event. He warned against drawing structural conclusions from a politically charged emergency involving a uniquely placed patient. It was elegant. It might have worked if Sorrel had remained silent. Instead, Helix patched in the protected recovery channel. The chamber dimmed. Sorrel Keith appeared on the suspended display, still pale, bandaged, speaking from medical bed under witness protocol. His voice was thinner than before, but steadier. "I am Sorrel Caith," he said. "I confirm that Dr. Vivian Rourke operated on me after my escort team and council licensing personnel were informed that standard protocol was unlikely to preserve my continuity." The room did not move, but attention sharpened, until it felt almost physical. The presenting counsel tried to narrow it once. "Heir Caith, were you competent to evaluate a highly specialized neural intervention under transport trauma?" Sorrel's gaze did not waver. "I was competent to understand that I was dying while authorized personnel argued about whether a human surgeon could use the method most likely to stop it." Vale's jaw tightened. Tal went very still. Sorrel continued. "I further state that I heard the phrase central approval matters more than improvisation during the delay before I lost speech." The chair asked by whom. Sorrel closed his eyes briefly, not for effect, but effort. The wording came from a licensing exchange. Advocate Vale was present. Inspector Tal was present. Whether they originated it or accepted it, I cannot say. I can say no one in that room prioritized my survival over procedural control until Dr. Rourke did. Tal rose instantly. "The witness is recovering from invasive intervention and may be confabulating under neural instability." Before the chair could rule, Surratt stood. "Earth requests permission to submit supplementary records relevant to systemic pattern," she said. "Tal objectif. This proceeding concerns an individual clinical violation." Surratt's voice stayed level. "That distinction no longer holds. A protected patient has testified that procedural control overrode rescue in a high-visibility case. Earth submits that the event before this chamber is not isolated. We have compiled comparative records across multiple systems showing a repeated pattern of delayed access, fracture classification, and fatalities mislabeled as species incompatibility." Petra transmitted the file. It took several seconds for the chamber display to absorb the volume. Names, dates, species, sites, injury geometries, timing overlaps, redactions. The effect was not theatrical. It was cumulative, a wall assembling in plain sight. Tal attacked the file's chain of custody. Synarch advisors attacked the interpretation. Vale attaqued relevância. They all shared one point. None of them wanted to discuss why so many deaths have been described in ways that stopped anyone outside the licensing. Architecture from seeing the pattern. One adjudicator, a silver-skinned representative from the Southern Lattice Worlds, asked the most dangerous question of the day. Why would such fragmentation exist, if not to obstruct cross-case visibility? Silence followed. Not complete silence. The expensive, meaningful version. Tal recovered first. There are legitimate privacy, species specificity, and jurisdictional reasons for segmented archives. Vivian was already standing again. Then why do the same injury signatures recur across those segments with the same delayed intervention points and the same post-mortem language? The chair allowed her. She brought up the comparison model she and Lien had built from the Helix data. Not prose now. Not rhetoric. Pattern. One case could always be exceptional. 3 cases raised concern. 13 forced a shape into view. This, she said, enlarging the relay collapse map, is not about a single human choice under pressure. This is a restricted rescue pathway treated as though broader access would threaten or more than repeated preventable deaths do. A Synarch legal director rose to challenge her and made the mistake of sounding too rehearsed. He described ownership, calibration, liability, misuse, and species protection. He talked as if the galaxy were a delicate instrument that would shatter if emergency tools left approved hands. Vivian let him finish. Then she asked quietly, "How many of the dead would you like me to treat as acceptable calibration loss?" He did not answer. The chamber entered recess under visible strain. The public feeds exploded. That much was obvious even inside the controlled architecture. Surratt conferred with Petra in clipped murmurs. Tal spoke urgently into a private line. Vale stared at nothing. When the chamber reconvened, Synarch pushed its last durable defense. Hallandrux. Missing. No direct witness to the original licensing consolidation. Without him, they argued, Earth had inference but not institutional intent. It was clever. Intent mattered legally. Bodies did not always. Vivian rose for the final segment and understood with unusual clarity that she could not win by proving grand villainy. The system was too layered for that. The more truthful path was uglier and stronger. She had to prove that intent mattered less than function, that a structure built one way had evolved into a machine that preserved itself through death, whether or not its founders admitted it. She took her time. "I cannot show you every conversation that built this architecture," she said. "I cannot produce a vanished witness on command. What I can show you is what the architecture does. It delays access. It fragments records. It narrows responsibility. It turns repeated preventable deaths into isolated administrative outcomes. If you prefer to argue that no one intended that result, then what you are defending is not malice. It is a system so devoted to protecting control that the effect of death no longer troubles it enough to change." The words traveled farther than any shout could have. She looked up at the adjudicators, then at the galleries, then finally at Tal and Vale and the rows of officials who had trusted complexity to blur consequence. In my operating room, Sorrel Kaith was not a symbol, a jurisdiction, or an heir. He was a patient with time running out. The license protocol was insufficient. The available intervention was restricted. I used it because rescue was still possible. She paused only once. "So I want the chamber to answer plainly what every family in these records deserves answered plainly. In your records, what exactly was forbidden? This procedure? Or the fact that someone who was supposed to die did not die?" No one spoke for several seconds after that. The chamber had heard technical arguments all day. This was not technical. It was simple enough to survive translation, replay, and memory, which is why it frightened them. The ruling did not come immediately. It could not. Too much had already escaped control. Outside, on the long public walk beyond the chamber, the crowd had grown rather than dispersed. Vivian saw physicians holding silent signs for archive review, union stewards from freight guilds, families with legal packets, trade channel reporters trying to sound neutral while realizing neutrality was becoming a more visible choice. The night that followed was worse for the powerful than the hearing itself. More names surfaced. Survivor groups, shared sealed records, and stories of loved ones told. There was no option when the language now sounded eerily familiar. Frontier clinics spoke about transfers delayed by licensing questions while patients deteriorated. Mixed species hospitals on secondary lanes reported their own near misses. Synarch replied with warnings about chaos. The warnings no longer felt paternal. They felt self-protective. Earth made its decision the next morning in public. Ambassador Surratt stood before the press wall and rejected the back-channel framework without naming it directly. She did not posture. That was what made it sting. Earth will not accept any resolution, she said, that treats a demonstrably survivable emergency as a private exception in order to avoid review of prior deaths. We are prepared to participate in lawful redesign of civilian emergency access. We are not prepared to exchange silence for status. That sentence moved through the feeds like current. Kaith Concord, forced to answer, split in full view of everyone. One senior bloc elder denounced opportunistic exploitation of a family crisis. Another, older and harder, declared that if the heir of their own Concord could be left to die under protective procedure, then protection itself had lost meaning. The fracture mattered because it told the wider council they could no longer bury the dispute inside human grievance. Their own house was now on the floor. By the time the chamber reconvened for ruling, the question before it had widened beyond anything Tal or Synarch had intended to manage. They could still punish Vivian. They could still try, but doing so now risked confirming the very logic she had accused them of defending. The presiding adjudicator delivered the decision with the careful tone institutions use when forced to retreat without admitting retreat. Dr. Vivian Rourke would not be cleared outright. The chamber reserved full judgment pending comprehensive review. Her emergency action, however, would not be treated as presumptive criminal misconduct. Her right to practice would be provisionally. maintained under civilian emergency authority. An independent inter-block inquiry would be opened into neural emergency licensing fragmentation across shared medical jurisdictions. Certain exclusivity provisions relevant to adaptive bridge access in neutral civilian facilities would be temporarily suspended during investigation. A special review board would examine prior fatalities associated with the identified pattern. The ruling was not justice in its final form. It was something more realistic and, in its own way, more damaging to the old order. A forced opening. Tal heard it like a man swallowing ground glass. Sinark heard it like a market collapse waiting to be priced. Vale heard it with a face so controlled it revealed almost nothing except relief too reluctant to call itself gratitude. The galleries did not erupt. Rules prevented that. But the pressure in the room changed. People straightened. Some wept quietly. A freight union delegate simply lowered her head and held it there for several seconds as if to say at last. Vivian did not feel victorious. She felt tired. More tired than after the surgery. Surgery had a table, a body, and a clock. This had no clean edge. Even now, the inquiry could be delayed, diluted, or redirected. Drax was still missing. Plenty of people would work very hard to turn the ruling into symbolic maintenance instead of structural change. Surat touched her elbow once. You heard it. I heard the beginning of a fight no one can now pretend not to be in. Surat looked almost pleased. Good. You are still a surgeon. The aftermath was not a parade. It was work. Over the next 48 hours, Earth refused 3 revised cooperation packages, each one more flattering and more corrupt than the last. Helix became a transit point for auditors, journalists, survivor advocates, and physicians who suddenly remembered records they had once chosen not to question. Inquiry teams demanded access across systems that had never expected their archive walls to matter in public. Some complied. Some stalled. Some discovered technical failures, so convenient they might as well have had signatures. Vivian returned to Helix before the feed cycle lost its appetite for the story. She wanted the station's hum, the practical ugliness of equipment, the ordinary rhythm of a place where bodies remain bodies even after governments turn them into debate. Lien met her at docking with the expression of someone who had been half afraid she would return as a symbol instead of a person. You look terrible, Lien said. I've been internationally appreciated. That does tend to happen. They walked together through the medical corridor where staff now greeted Vivian with a mixture of respect and wary curiosity. Neutral stations survived by remembering that every celebrated act eventually became a policy memo. Still, the glances were different now. Less calculation, more recognition. Sorrel Kaith had been moved out of isolation into a secured recovery suite with lighter monitoring and actual daylight simulation. When Vivian entered, he was sitting upright, slowly working one hand through motor exercises. The movement was clumsy but real. You are harder to kill than your escorts suggested, Vivian said. His mouth curved, brief and dry. I was about to say the same. Up close, recovery made him look older than his public images had. There was weight in his face now that propaganda rarely permitted in heirs. How much do you remember? Vivian asked. Enough. He set down the motor frame. Enough to know my existence became expensive. It was expensive before. You simply got to watch the invoice being drafted. That earned a real, tired laugh. Then the room sobered again. I received messages from within my Concord, Sorrel said. Some thanking me for speaking. Some wishing I had waited. Some advising me to describe my memory as uncertain for the good of stability. Vivian leaned against the chair rail. And will you? He met her eyes. No. Stability built on deliberate helplessness is only delay with better tailoring. There was more spine in that answer than the public had been shown. Good. The future would require it. You should know, he continued, that the internal block conflict is worse than the feed show. If the inquiry confirms what your file suggests, several accords may have to be renegotiated. Medical, corridors, patent revenue shares, liability treaties. People will say that is your reason to back away. People say many things when their comfort is threatened. He looked at his own hands. Dr. Rourke, I was raised inside this machinery. I knew it was compromised. I did not understand how thoroughly it had trained itself to call preventable loss unavoidable. Vivian thought of every family now sending records into the inquiry channels. Most people do not understand a system until it reaches their own bed. Sorrel inclined his head. That may be the least flattering truth I have learned in years. Before leaving, she checked his interface map. The bridge held. Not perfectly. Nothing ever did after damage like that. But it held with the stubbornness of a road someone had nearly forbidden into existence. The inquiry widened over the next month. That part of the story never made a dramatic arc as satisfying as the hearing, but it mattered more. Some witnesses emerged. Others vanished into polite unavailability. A junior archival analyst from a lattice world released memo fragments showing category changes around cross-species neural failure reporting. 2 insurance cooperatives admitted under pressure that certain restricted interventions had been priced out of neutral civilian use by design. Frontier medics testified that emergency transfer delays had become so normal they were treated as weather. Halen Drax remained absent. His silence became its own indictment. Synarch fought on every front. They funded expert panels, flooded feeds with warnings about uncontrolled medicine, and tried to reframe Earth as opportunistic. The effort partly worked. Power rarely loses everything at once, but they no longer controlled the central sentence. Vivian's question had done too much damage to the old framing. Was the danger the procedure, or the survival it made visible? On Helix, life resumed in altered form. Freighters still docked. Trauma still arrived without regard for reform schedules. Vivian still operated. That was the strangest comfort of all. The galaxy could be in the middle of a moral argument, and someone would still rupture a relay cluster in cargo loading. On the same day, bodies did not wait for theory. One late cycle, Petra joined Vivian in the staff corridor with 2 cups of the station's terrible coffee substitute. You have become unpopular in very expensive places, Petra said. I was hoping for a plaque. I can get you a reprimand in a nice frame. They drank in silence for a moment. Do you regret it? Petra asked. Vivian knew what the question really meant. Not the hearing. The first decision. The one under bright lights with a life collapsing in front of her and authority telling her to be careful in exactly the wrong direction. No, she said. Then, after a beat, I regret how easy it is to imagine that if I had followed protocol, some report would already have made his death sound tidy enough to survive. Petra nodded. That is why they fear people like you. No, they fear records that stop agreeing to lie. Petra raised the cup slightly. Then let's hope the records keep misbehaving. Weeks later, the provisional reforms reached their first real test. A civilian transport from the Rim came through with a relay trauma presentation close enough to the newly identified pattern that the emergency board was forced to decide under public scrutiny whether the adaptive bridge access suspension meant anything. This time the answer was yes. The patient received the intervention without waiting for a hierarchy to feel comfortable. He survived. It was only one life. Vivian knew better than most how often systems smother change by making one humane choice and calling the debt settled. Still, one life mattered. One changed line in one chart mattered. One family not receiving a carefully worded explanation mattered. The day she signed that discharge summary, Surat sent a private message from Earth Mission. Not a victory, a breach. Vivian saved the words and said nothing. Much later, after the feeds had moved on to new scandals and threatened accords, Helix returned almost fully to its old shape. Almost. The difference lived in habit now. Archive requests that used to die quietly received follow-up. Transfer denials were challenged faster. Mixed species emergency panels cited the inquiry when pushing back. Against deadening delays. Not revolution. Something perhaps more durable. Embarrassed systems learning that someone was finally watching the places where their language touched real flesh. Vivian stood once more at the observation corridor, looking down at Orthian's lanes. The station still sighed at artificial dawn. Cargo still moved like intention made metal. Somewhere beyond the freight tracks and diplomatic spines, whole committees were probably still trying to decide what story history would tell about the hearing. Human disruption, regulatory correction, civic accountability, licensing crisis, political theater. Each label would fight for dominance because labels were cheaper than change. Lian joined her with a data pad tucked under one arm. Another request from a border clinic, she said. They want guidance on adaptive bridge thresholds for a species we have barely mapped. Vivian took the pad. Send the provisional framework and tell them to call live if timing collapses. Lian hesitated. You know, some people are going to spend years blaming you for what opened. Good, Vivian said. That means it opened. Below them, a shuttle bearing Caith Concord colors detached from the station and turned toward the lanes. Sorrel was leaving for extended rehabilitation in a political life that would never again fit the old masks quite as neatly. Whether he would spend that life using what he had learned or merely surviving it, Vivian could not know. The same was true of Earth. The same was true of the Council. Systems learned slowly. People learned unevenly. There were always ways to retreat into better phrasing. But phrasing had limits now. Somewhere in sealed archives, names were being reopened. Somewhere on a neutral ward, a doctor was arguing with a protocol and had one more tool than last season. Somewhere in a chamber built to keep order elegant, officials had heard a question simple enough to haunt them every time another case crossed their desks. Vivian looked at the trade lanes, at the moving lights of a galaxy still very capable of building beautiful structures around cruel choices, and felt no triumph. Only steadiness. She had not forced the Council to become just. She had not broken the machinery in one speech. She had done something both smaller and, perhaps, more dangerous. She had made it harder for the machinery to call itself innocent while it worked. That was enough for now. On the far wall, a public information screen cycled through routine station notices, freight advisories, and one quiet line about emergency practice changes in mixed species civilian trauma. No fanfare, no onsim, just policy adjusted because too many people had finally seen the cost of the old one. Lian read it and gave a soft sound that might have been amusement or disbelief. Not exactly a heroic ending, she said. Vivian kept her eyes on the lanes. No, what would you call it? Vivian thought of the dockworker on Luna, of Hale and Drax somewhere beyond easy reach, of Sorrel asking whether anyone had recorded his consent, of every family that had once been told there was no other way, of the patient at the border clinic who would now live in a different branch of the story because one door no longer stayed locked by default. Then she answered, a correction, and maybe that was the part the galaxy had never really understood. Humanity was never dangerous because it was louder, stronger, or more ruthless than everyone else. Humanity was dangerous because when a life could still be saved, it refused to look away. It refused to hide behind procedure. It refused to dress profit up as principle. And it refused to let a cold system decide who was still worth fighting for. Vivian Rourke did not walk out of that chamber as a legend. She walked out as something harder to ignore. A doctor who had done her job, a woman who had stood her ground, and a human being who had forced an entire system to confront the cost of its own silence. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you why human stories matter in a galaxy that keeps trying to forget them, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful science fiction, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps this channel grow, and it helps bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are, I hope the rest of your day brings you a little more strength, a little more clarity, and a little more hope.